Well, I've been interested in this paleo diet concept for a long, long time. I first read Boyd Eaton's paper in the New England Journal of Medicine. It was published in '85, and I read it in '87, and I thought it was just about the best idea I'd ever heard on how can we optimize human nutrition. And so that's really where my lifelong journey started, was reading the cross-references to that first paper. And of course, anybody who reads scientific literature, you realizes that every article that you read has other cross-references. And so there's this incredible spider web of papers. So I ended up having tens of thousands of papers. In those days, we didn't have PDF files. So my entire office was filled with all this. You know, I'd killed so many trees. But that's kind of how the whole thing started. And I have graduate students because I'm a professor at a Division I research institute. And we make our living by getting grants and writing scientific papers. So this was kind of my hobby that ended up becoming my, not just avocation, it became my passion. And that's how the whole thing happened. And early on in the game, I took a couple of my PhD students and I said, hey, if we're going to eliminate 2 food groups in processed foods, what in the hell are we got left? What is the diet going to look like? Are we going to end up being deficient? And that's kind of how my books came about, is I found out not only are we not deficient, is that we are absolutely sufficient. We are incredibly rich diets by eliminating these foods. So this is kind of what this talk is all about, and that's how it evolved. And you've seen this slide before, is that these foods comprise 70% of the energy in the U.S. diet, but they were rarely or never consumed by our hunter-gatherer ancestors. And so it was never my intent, and the popular press got this wrong, and because I was at ground zero in this concept, people that read about it, they don't go back and read our original papers, what we were trying to do. We were never trying to replicate a hunter-gatherer diet precisely. All we were trying to do was to emulate it with foods that you could basically go down and get at the supermarket or Whole Foods, or your grass-produced meat folk. So that's what we were trying to do. And you can see here that these are the foods that I'm suggesting. Was there anything in Stone Age times that looked like that? No. Carrots were not big and orange. They were tiny little things the size of your finger. They were white or purple, and you didn't get much out of them. And same way, there was no such thing that looked like this. The meat looked a little bit like this, and the wild fish looked a lot like that. There was nothing here. But when you eat these foods, it does a tremendous amount of good for our bodies. And so there's no real absolute paleo diet. This is a rule of thumb. So you practitioners just take this with I don't want to say grain of salt. But realize there's a little bit of wiggle room here. So this is usually what we see in hunter-gatherers on average, is a little bit more than half their energy from animal foods, and the balance from plant foods. They didn't eat grains, and they didn't really process their foods. And so the typical macronutrient breakdown then is very high protein, tends to be lower in carb, and fat tends to be sometimes lower, but mainly it was higher. And so we really can't eat wild plant foods like this Kung woman showing us her gruya berries and tamamelons, and we can eat unprocessed fruits, and we'll talk about the difference between the two, is that the wild plant foods are typically smaller, more fiber, less sugar. So the amount of fructose that you get in an apple or in grapes, you don't really see that very often. And people with the metabolic syndrome they should watch their intake of this until they get their body weight reduced and their insulin sensitivity normalized. There's slightly greater minerals because we don't harvest wild plants year in and year out and then take the entire plant away from the field. So the nutrients, the minerals, go back into the soil for the next generation of plants. Whereas in a modern field, we take the plants away and we gradually deplete the minerals. Vitamins are determined genetically, so they're about the same. There's some variation here if you look species to species. These are the 20 most commonly consumed vegetables in the U.S. diet. So any vegetable is fair game, particularly ethnic markets and whatever. The only ones that aren't, potatoes, maintain glycemic responses that are very non-paleo-like, and they also are very high sources of anti-nutrients. They contain a variety of alkaloids and lectins that Pedro Bastos may talk to you about. Sweet corn is a grain, so it's eliminated, and beans, green beans, are also eliminated because in their native state, most legumes are indigestible because of their high anti-nutrient content. These are the 20 most commonly consumed fruits. As I mentioned, you need to be a little bit careful with some of these fruits. If you go to my website, I actually have a listing of the fructose content of all commonly consumed fruits, so you can advise your patients which are the low sugar fruits. Dry fruits you need to be careful with because they can elicit high glycemic responses. Athletes and people that have exquisite insulin sensitivity, it doesn't seem to be much of a problem, particularly in training. These are the 20 most commonly consumed seafood. We are depleting the world's ocean of wild fish, so there are sustainability issues here that really transcend the paleo diet. One of the things that I would be careful with are farmed fish because it reduces the long-chain omega-3s and increases omega-6s, and frequently they're fed cereal grains. So most of us don't have the luxury of eating wild game meat, and many of us, if you've ever tried it, you say it tastes gamey, you don't like it. But we can get grass-produced domestic meats, and that's a good second choice. So if you look at wild meat, as I mentioned earlier, wild game is very, very lean, and in Colorado we have a lot of game, and so we've done human interventions with wild game and do nothing else, and it seems to improve blood lipid profiles. So you can get domestically produced grass and pasture meats that are fairly similar to wild meats, and you can see one of the reasons why they're much more expensive, but buy the whole carcass. And so my wife and I, we live in Colorado, and that's how we do it. We buy half a side of grass-produced bison or a half a side of beef, get it processed, cut up, and we've got a couple of freezers that we put it in. Now that two of the boys are out of the house and in college, not so much anymore, but we were eating a ton of meat at the time. So what are other strategies to enrich the omega-3 fatty acid content of a contemporary paleo diet? Let me just go back here, is that the amounts of omega-3s, milligrams per 100 grams of beef, is relatively low. So you won't, if you were to eat only grass-produced beef, you can see here's the total omega-3. Even though you get almost 100 milligrams isn't going to cut it. And so let me show you what you really need to do. And you need to take a couple of dietary strategies when you're on a contemporary or modern paleo diet. Again, grass-produced meats, they taste better, healthier, typically less exogenous materials put into them, hormones and pesticides and whatever. Fatty fish, salmon is a really good way to go. Eat it a couple times a week, or mackerel, and you're in good shape. Supplement with fish oil. I don't recommend cod liver oil because cod liver oil is a mixture of vitamin D and A, and it turns out that mixture may not be so good. So if you're going to get fish oil, get it from the flesh of fish. Omega-3 enriched eggs, or better yet, get free-ranging eggs. They taste better. So if we look at the recommended omega-3 fatty acid intake, these are the long-chain, EPA and DHA. You can see we have 4 categories here. We have the current North American intake, which is way too low. And you can see what the American Heart Association recommends for their coronary patients. And so the difference, the gap, can be as much as 770 milligrams per day. Yet you can see here that by simply consuming a quarter pound of Atlantic salmon, you can get as much as you need for the cardiovascular protective effects, and it tastes good. So these are the 10 most commonly consumed nuts and seeds in the U.S. diet. You can see those, and this next table shows you the fatty acid composition, and you can see that most nuts are very high in linoleic acid and 6 fatty acids, and they have virtually no long-chain fatty acids, and very few of them have alpha-linolenic acid, or 18,3-N3, which is an omega-3, but that has to be chain elongated in the liver to the longer fatty acids to really have biological effects. So the point here is that you can derail a contemporary paleo diet by eating a ton of nuts and dried fruit and whatever, and thinking you're having a healthy diet, but actually you're having a high glycemic load, high linoleic acid diet. So this is not a good strategy. Use them in salads, use a handful occasionally, but don't eat the hell out of them every single day. So here's some healthful oils and their characteristics, or what are thought to be healthful. Hunter-gatherers never ate any oils, so there could always be an argument saying that you shouldn't do it, but as far as I know, there are no really adverse health effects of any of these. Well, flaxseed, there's some papers, some epidemiologic papers, suggesting there's a link with prostate cancer, but the experimental studies in animals don't show it. So all the rest of these seem to be fairly healthful, including coconut oil. And as I mentioned, coconut oil ends up being healthful because even though it may elevate blood cholesterol, it doesn't seem to increase the risk for heart disease, and it seems to lower inflammation because it contains high amounts of lauric acid, or 12:0. Okay, so when I decided that let's check this out, let's see what happens if we try to eat a contemporary diet based on the food groups that our hunter-gatherer ancestors ate, but foods that we could get at the supermarket. And so I had a graduate student, Lynn Tui. She ended up getting her PhD and has become fairly well known in the health industry. She ran about 300 or 400 of these computerized dietary analyses for me. I said, let's do everything we can possibly do. So we got a stack of papers, and it takes her a little while to key it all in and then to analyze it, whatever. So this is a representative daily meal plan for somebody eating paleo. And you can see, so she starts off, and this 25-year-old female who's eating 2,200 kilocalories, starts off eating cantaloupe, broiled salmon for breakfast, lunch, great big salad, pork chops, dinner is another huge salad, steamed broccoli, and lean beef, and for dessert, just a big bowl of strawberries, and she can snack pretty much all day long with these carrot, celery sticks, and oranges. So we made up all kinds of plans. So this was fairly representative of what we saw. And we wanted to contrast that to the USDA recommended diet. And so the USDA changed from being a food pyramid to being My Plate in 2011. And so that's what we're going to do, is I'm going to show you what the nutrient characteristics of a contemporary paleo diet look like, and we're going to contrast those to the food pyramid or the food plate. So the food plate replaced the pyramid in 2011, and really there was not a whole lot of difference other than taking, if you look here, the little diagram, taking the kind of, they still recommend exercise, but they've just taken the stair steps out of it because they thought this was too confusing, and this was easier for the average person to get. So that's why it was done, but no real substantive changes. So what are the goals of the pyramid, the plate? They want a diet that's adequate in protein, vitamins, minerals. There's no DRI for fiber. They suggest that you should eat 20 to 35 grams a day, and obviously all these other things, calories, fat. This is a horrible recommendation right here because it's not based on good science. So it's not a quantitative issue, it's a qualitative issue. Yeah, let's get the trans fats out of the diet. Let's get some of the unhealthy fats out of the diet, some of the isomers that are made with food production. Saturated fat doesn't seem to be an issue anymore. The meta-analyses out of the Harvard School of Public Health in the last 4 or 5 years tell us that saturated fat really wasn't the boogeyman we once thought it was. I'll show you cholesterol has virtually no effect on the diet. This one is kind of misleading. So for those of you that are out there with your pen and pencil on that slide, multiply sodium by 2.54, and that tells you how many grams of salt are in the diet. So this looks kind of like a low number, but when you multiply it by 2.54, you can still see that the recommended values for salt are way too high. So if we compare the USDA recommendations to what we actually consume in the U.S. diet, you'll notice then that we eat too much sugar. We don't get enough fiber compared to what the pyramid recommends. We're pretty close to the fat recommendations, but we're fatter than we've ever been. So it doesn't seem that fat per se has much of an effect on obesity. And it may not have much of an effect on cardiovascular disease or cancer either. And maybe dietary factors that promote inflammation are more important. Okay, and so you can see we've been good little boys and girls, and we've gotten our cholesterol values down below recommended. But I'll show you here in a minute, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. And we're still eating way too much salt. So if we look at these were RDAs. RDAs were changed to DRIs in the last 10 years or so. And the Centers for Disease Control and the USDA hasn't published the data in this fashion, but to me it was just wonderful. So the numbers are still about the same. This is data that goes back to 1994 and 96. And you can see then that the 13 nutrients most lacking in the U.S. diet, almost everybody doesn't get enough zinc. Almost everybody doesn't get enough calcium, but I'll show you in a minute that may not be problematic if you're doing other things. And about half of the population doesn't get enough B6 or vitamin A. So those are the 13 nutrients most lacking in the U.S. diet. So if we summarize the differences in actual versus recommended values, well, this is nothing new. Too much sugar, not enough fiber, too much fat, too much saturated fat, too much sodium. The total fat and saturated fat we're going to examine, and as a population, we are deficient in these trace nutrients most often. Now, what I wanted to do is I wanted to contrast the paleo diet, that contemporary one where we started off with the cantaloupe and the salmon for breakfast. I wanted to contrast that diet to the food pyramid, the food plate, and see how it came out. So a couple of things stick out almost immediately. We're getting way more protein than what we get in the food pyramid, food plate. The question comes up, is that therapeutic or does it have adverse health effects? We get considerably lower carbohydrate, and is that therapeutic or does that have adverse effects? And how do endurance athletes cope with this? We have a little bit fewer sugars because we're still eating a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables, but there are no processed sugars, and high fructose corn syrup certainly isn't in any of it. We're getting considerably more fat, as you can see. We are, one of the ones that really stands out is the food pyramid, food plate, still makes no recommendations for long-chain omega-3s in the diet, which to my way of thinking is totally foolish. Whereas in the contemporary paleo diet, we're getting a ton of it. And if you look at the sodium to potassium ratio, you can see how far out of whack the plate pyramid is compared to what we have. Now, this is an interesting one that just totally blew me away. The very first time that Lynn Toohey started making these printouts and we started looking at them consistently again and again and again, we saw these numbers. And if you look at the food pyramid or food plate and you look at the percentage of the trace nutrients for all these DRIs, the paleo diet just absolutely blows it away. Look at those numbers. It's so much more nutrient dense. So the question that came up in my mind was, why is this? If we've eliminated two food groups in processed foods, why is the nutrient density so much greater? Well, let's take a look. So this was the next thing I did, and we published this in an AJCN paper. And I don't know how much standard dietitians took note of it, but they should have. So we got the various food groups that you could eat with a contemporary paleo diet, whole grains. You wouldn't drink whole milk, but we threw them in there anyway. Fruits, veggies, seafood, meats, nuts, and seeds. So then what I did is I ranked each one of these food groups with a superscript from 7 to having the highest concentration to 1 having the lowest. And then what I did is I summed the ranked scores and put them down here. And so what these values then represent is the nutrient density of a specific food group. And so this approach had never been taken. And to me, if we're going to make recommendations to what people should and should not eat, it's kind of like if you're a coach on a track team and you don't know how fast your runners can run. Should this guy be a sprinter or an endurance guy? So we need to know what the overall nutrient density of a food group is before we make blanket recommendations, right? So why are we telling the entire population to eat grains and drink whole milk when, at the end of the day, these are nutrients that come up at the bottom of the stack? Humans don't have a grain requirement. There is nothing, no nutrient that we can't get without eating grains. The same way with dairy products. We can get everything we need without dairy products. Now, the dairy industry will tell us we can't get enough calcium. So we're going to examine that in a little bit more detail. So if you decide to eat dairy products and whole grains, you're going to displace other more nutrient-dense, healthy foods. And that's why these numbers came out so great for those trace nutrients. So these are to summarize, these are the important differences. Protein is higher, carbs lower, cholesterol is higher, calcium is lower, and vitamin D, there's none. We actually have zero vitamin D in any of those diets that I've shown you. So those are the issues that we're going to look at. Is there too little calcium in contemporary paleo diets? We don't have any vitamin D. Is there too much cholesterol? And how about all that protein? Is that good or is that bad for us? So those are the issues that came out of these computerized dietary analyses. Let's first off take a look at calcium intake and see how we can get around that. If we look at the actual U.S. diet, we don't make the DRI ourselves. So this is for that 25-year-old woman. We only get about 70% of our calcium. Paleo diet is similar. It gets 69%, but with no dairy products. And the food pyramid ends up getting 122% because it includes dairy products regularly. So anytime you look at a trace nutrient in the diet, what you really need to look at is balance. And it's misleading to look at one side of the equation only. And so the dairy industry would tell us that if we're looking at calcium, all we should look at is how much calcium is coming in, not how much calcium we lose in our body. And so these are the sources of calcium in our diet. It's the amount ingested. But as I'll show you here in a minute, the calcium curves show that most of the calcium that we ingest is not absorbed. So if you drink a glass of milk, about 75% of the calcium is not absorbed. There are tricks you can do nutritionally to increase the absorption rate. And then there are things we can do to reduce the calcium, the urinary calcium loss rate. And that seems to be the strategy Mother Nature through evolution has taken so that all mammals can build strong bones and maintain healthy bones throughout their life if they live in their normal ecologic niche. So elephants and rhinoceroses and deer and elk, they all tend not to get osteoporosis in their normal native niche, whereas captive animals sometimes do. So let's consider calcium input, the input side of the equation. DRI is at 1,000 milligrams, and so if a woman consumes 2,200 kilocalories, the calcium density required to achieve the DRI, you simply divide the DRI by the kilocalories, and that gives you this critical number. 0.455 milligrams per kcal of food is what's required. Well, let's just go through and analyze this. And once again, this approach had rarely been taken. So if we analyze food groups, you can see here's what we need to make the DRI. There's the magic number. There's only two foods that can do it. One is whole milk and the other is vegetables. Well, hunter-gatherers didn't drink milk. So this was out. All right? This is what they had to do. This is what they had to play with to get this number, assuming that that number is correct. So let's look at the caveats. So this is the evolutionary template we had to place over the model and come up with a solution. And that's really what this evolutionary template helps with, is to come up with these solution to complex diet health-related problems. So if we look at the mean calcium density in those 20 commonly consumed vegetables, we eliminate potatoes and corn and green beans, then the average calcium content of those 20 vegetables in the U.S. diet is 1.28 milligrams per kcal. Now, you know, you can kind of fiddle with this number a little bit depending on which vegetables you're looking at. So if you put in more leafy greens, there's an issue with leafy greens, oxalates, and so forth. But let's just take a broad average number. and that's what we come up with. So that's 1,000 milligrams of calcium divided by 1.28. We have to eat 35% of our energy from vegetables. All right, well, is that reasonable? It's tough to do, but it can be done. Particularly, if you steam your veggies and so forth, and you make an effort to eat a lot of vegetables at every meal, you can certainly easily get the DRI without doing calcium. So how did these guys? These guys certainly didn't drink milk. And how did they survive and have healthy bones? There are some DEXA studies of non-westernized populations in which we examine the bone mineral density, and it doesn't seem to be a huge problem. So people living in tropical African environments not drinking milk seem to still have healthy bones. Okay, so let's look at the output side of the equation. So remember, calcium balance is more important than either the input or the output side. And a diet that produces a net acidosis then tends to increase calcium losses, and you'll hear more about this later this afternoon. The typical Western diet, as I mentioned, yields a chronic metabolic acidosis. This is one of my colleague Tony Sebastian's co-workers that published this way back in the 80s. And that example diet that I gave you, the one that started off with the cantaloupe and the lettuce and all those salads and whatever, we calculated the values using Remmer and Manz's a way of doing it. And for Linda in the crowd, the reason I did it this way was because it was simpler than your equation. So it took me a little bit longer, but I suspect that we would come out fairly close using both techniques. And so what are some of the values that can help with calcium input side of the equation? Increasing absorption. And so sunshine increases vitamin D absorption. Hunter-gatherers were pretty much outside all day long. They got a lot of vitamin D. That helps. And recently it's found out that dietary protein also increases intestinal calcium absorption. So the earlier studies showing that high dietary protein caused calciuresis, well, yeah, it increased the calcium losses in the urine, but if you don't measure the difference between what is absorbed, then you don't really know if you're in calcium balance or not. And those Beth Dawson Hughes finally got around to doing those studies about 5 or 6 years ago, and we now find out that high protein, yeah, it increases calcium losses, but it also increases calcium absorption, and it tends to promote bone growth because it also stimulates IGF-1. So the bottom line then, it's possible to achieve DRIs on non-dairy foods. Calcium balance is a bigger issue. And just to keep it safe, try to get 30 to 40% of your calories from fruits and veggies, just like the model we showed. And one of these days we'll have a dietary intervention in which we actually evaluate that. So no natural foods, or very few natural foods, I'll put it that way, have concentrated sources of vitamin D. You can get a little bit in cod liver oil and marine mammals. And started in the 50s and the 60s, milk and margarine were fortified with vitamin D. So that's where most Americans get it, from two food groups that I don't advocate you consume in contemporary paleo diets because of the trans fat issue and margarine. Some margarines that we can make now without trans fats, but I still think they have isomeric fatty acids besides trans fats that people don't tell you about. So there's isomers that are produced in these processes which are probably just as lethal as our trans fats. So hunter-gatherers then had to get all of their sun or their vitamin D from solar synthesis. The exception is polar hunter-gatherers could get significant amounts of vitamin D from marine animals. What are the recommended values? I'm preaching to the choir here, so I don't have to spend a lot of time with this slide, is that we're trying to achieve plasma concentration somewhere between 40 and 70 nanograms per milliliter. As practitioners, I know many of you monitor this closely and you try to get your values up to that. And this is Michael Hollick's work and others that have been in Hollis's that have been studying this for their entire career. So the recommendations, the DRIs, 600 IUs just don't cut it. You've got to get people that are deficient, you've got to supplement to the tune of anywhere from 2,000 to 7,000 IUs. And then once you achieve the magical plateau of 40 nanograms, you need to take 1 to 2,000 IUs per day, or get yourself out in the sunshine like this guy did, and I did when I was a young man, lifeguarded for 20 years on a beach in California. Okay, so how about cholesterol intake? If you look at the cholesterol in the U.S. diet, we've actually done what the government told us to do. We got our intake below 300 milligrams, and the food pyramid, or the paleo diet, is way high, and the food pyramid is low. So is that going to cause a problem? Does dietary cholesterol have an adverse effect on health? There's an equation called the Howell equation, and there's an earlier one that was published in the 60s, but this is the most recent version. And what it does is it allows us to predict how dietary saturated fat, polyunsaturated fats, and cholesterol impact plasma cholesterol. In the vernacular, if we have any statisticians out here, this is referred to as a multiple regression equation, and it predicts one variable from two or more variables. So if we take that Howell equation and we lower the amount of cholesterol from 491, which is what we had in the example paleo diet, down to 300, it only drops plasma or blood cholesterol by 4.5 milligrams per deciliter. Any of you that are practitioners realize that we don't have that kind of precision or resolution, can you? You can't measure cholesterol one day and then measure it the very next day in 2 different labs or 3 different labs and get the same results. So there's very few labs that can measure it to this kind of precision. And you can see then if we cut it from 491 to 219, if you start off with high blood cholesterol, it only reduces at 2.5%, which is, as I mentioned, beyond the scope and resolution of most studies. The P to S ratio seems to be very important. This is an older study showing that if you get a dietary P to S ratio that is greater than 80, you can add all the dietary cholesterol you want to your diet, and it has virtually no effect on plasma LDL. And when we talk about cardiovascular disease, I don't know if James O'Keefe has arrived yet, but he'll probably talk to you a little bit about that. It's not so much the plasma LDL, it's the oxidized LDL and the ratio of these particles to one another. And so hopefully James will be able to give you the lowdown. So the bottom line is that dietary cholesterol seems to have very little or no effect on blood cholesterol levels. And actually, saturated fat may have an important effect on the HDL to total cholesterol ratio. Okay, the final point I want to talk about here is dietary protein. So people that have been vegan or vegetarians, we've been under this myth that high protein diets have adverse effects on kidney function. And this came about via a fellow by the name of Brenner in New England Journal of Medicine many, many moons ago, suggesting that high protein increases glomerular filtration rates, or GFRs, and it causes glomerular sclerosis. And when that happens, then we have blood albumin falling out of the circulation into urine, and that suggests that we've got kidney malfunction. So people that have pre-existing kidney disease, you put them on a lower protein diet, GFR goes down, albumin gets out of their bloodstream, and bingo. So it must be protein that's causing the problem. Well, that's really faulty thinking, and I don't know how it ever got published in New England Journal, because it wouldn't in this day and age. So we know that higher proteins elevate GFR. Nobody's doubting that, all right? And vegetarians have lower GFRs. But the question that really needs to be asked and answered is, do high-protein diets promote kidney disease? And it wasn't until 1999 that Arne Ostrop's group at University of Copenhagen did this experiment. They put people on a high-protein diet, and they ran it for 6 months, and they didn't see any albumin appearing in the urine. And the GFR actually increased, but the kidney volume increased as well. So the kidney, or the GFR relative to kidney volume, remained the same. So the conclusion is that in healthy normals, high proteins had very little effect on kidney. That was the first study done. There was a really eloquent one that was just completed in 2012 showing the exact same effect. So I remember speaking in Germany back in the late 90s, and the German press was all there, and I was telling them that you ought to eat high protein to help your blood lipid levels. And they're all looking at me like I'm nuts. Wait a minute, how does that work? And Bernard Wolf's group in Canada was the very first folks to show this, that when you replaced carbohydrate with protein, it had a very therapeutic effect. And here's his results. This study has been, if it's been replicated once, it's been replicated 50 times since then. So we know this again and again and again. Nurses' Health Study, this is Frank Hu's work from the Harvard School of Public Health, showing that higher protein diets reduce the risk of heart disease in the Nurses' Health Study. And high protein diets then elevate metabolism because of their thermic effect. If you look at protein, it's 2 to 3 times the thermic effect of either protein or fat or carbohydrate. This, in the long haul, probably doesn't make a whole lot of difference, because to lose a pound of fat, you have to reduce your caloric intake by 3,500 kilocalories. So this is maybe affects people over the long haul, years and years and years, but probably the major effect of how protein helps people to lose weight is it's much more satiating than is carbohydrate or fat. And so there's at least 30 or 40 studies that have been out in the last 40 years showing this. More recently shown by Batterham's group, and the mechanism now is fairly well understood. PYY is certainly involved. It's a hormone secreted in the gut which influences the hypothalamus to help reduce hunger. And high protein, low glycemic load carbohydrate diets now have been conclusively shown to be about the best way in which we can lose weight. Once again, going back and looking at the historical literature, Arne Ostrop's group showed that a high protein group lost more weight than another. This result has been replicated, and here's the really cool study right here, is this one by Weigel et al., and this one was a randomized controlled trial in which they eliminated the criticism of the earlier studies. So if you're interested, find this one. And then the other study is the Diogenes study. The Diogenes study is an ongoing study in Europe, and it is shown with an enormous sample size, 500 or 600 people, that not only is a high protein, low glycemic load diet the best way to lose weight, it's the best way to keep weight off. So contrasting that to 5 other diets. So Diogenes, D-I-O-G-E-N-E-S. So medline that one and you can get that data. Okay, and high protein reduces the risk for stroke, and I'm going to finish up here so that our next presenter will have a little bit of time to come up and get ready to go. So high protein seems to reduce the risk for stroke, and epidemiologic studies, there's 4 or 5 different types of epidemiologic studies. For every one you find that has one effect, you can find 2 others that don't have the effect. So what we really need to look at are interventions in which actually control these variables. And here's a cool intervention showing that lean beef lowered blood pressure. If you have a higher protein diet, it seems to improve survival time for patients with breast cancer. This is the Harvard group as well. And so going back to the recommendations I think we need to consider is this type of a diet. Thank you very much.